Good evening and welcome to tonight's program. The Lincoln Presidential Foundation is proud to have recently launched our Fortifying Our Democracy, Lincoln's Lyceum Address. This project, made possible with generous support from Iron Mountain, explores the events that led Abraham Lincoln to deliver his speech, the perpetuation of our political institutions, to the Young Men's Lyceum in 1838, and the lessons that we can take from it today. The project includes an array of new resources available on our website, including a companion docuseries. In just a moment, we will be premiering the trailer and segment 3 of the docuseries, The Risk of Tyrants, followed by a discussion led by our president and CEO, Erin Carlson Mast, featuring Dr. Angela Ray and Dr. Manisha Sinha. My name is Phyllis Evans, and I'm the Senior Director of Development for the Foundation. Before we begin our program this evening, I'd like to thank each of you for joining us and remind you that following tonight's presentation, we will entertain questions from the audience. Please type your questions in the Q&A program box below, and we will get to as many as we can. And now the premiere of the trailer and segment 3 of Fortifying Our Democracy, Lincoln's Lyceum Address.
The 1830s were a very dynamic time.
This is the time when slavery enters in a big way into the national political arena.
It was a very violent period. Mob violence was a real problem. Lynchings, murders. It's a brutal, difficult time. Lots of people are concerned about whether or not this American experiment is going to survive.
Alexis de Tocqueville visits the United States in 1831 and writes a glowing book, Democracy in America. Some say the greatest book ever written about the United States, as well as the greatest book written about democracy. And yet, it's a period of considerable upheaval related to the rule of law. And that's, I think, what drew Lincoln to the Lyceum Address on that historic night in January of 1838.
The Lyceum Address invites us into the mind of a younger Lincoln already thinking about the major issues of his time.
Justice for all, irrespective of their background. That is what the Lyceum contributes like no other Lincoln speech. It is a profoundly prophetic speech. It's what we make of it rather than what was made of it at the time that I think is important.
It is to deny what the history of the world tells us is true, to suppose that men of ambition and talents will not continue to spring up amongst us. Lincoln is saying, if you have just rampant lawlessness and the law-abiding good people in the world are looking around and saying, what's in it for me? That opens the door to the possibility that someone who's ambitious, who's potentially tyrannical, can come in and say, I've got the answer. And the answer is power for me. I am going to save you from this chaos and this violence. What think you these places would satisfy an Alexander, a Caesar, or a Napoleon? Never. Towering genius disdains a beaten path. He's saying for ambitious men, like, will they be able to be satisfied in just maintaining the good thing that the founders built? Most certainly it cannot. Is it unreasonable then to expect that some man possessed of the loftiest genius coupled with ambition sufficient to push it to its utmost stretch will at some time spring up among us? And when such a one does, it will require the people to be united with each other, attached to the government and laws, and generally intelligent to successfully frustrate his designs. At the time when the United States was founded, they believed they were participating in this great, unprecedented experiment. But he says the experiment has largely succeeded. And so here we are. What are people of passion, people who want to make a difference? What are they going to commit themselves now that the nation is established? What happens when really ambitious men come forward who aren't content with just being a member of the legislature of Illinois or just being a lawyer, people who want more than that? He worries that people like that are going to look at what has succeeded about the United States and want to tear it down. That they're going to see that the only way they can make a difference is by destroying what previous generations have constructed. So it's a pretty urgent call for Americans to commit themselves to law, the Constitution, and also reason. That it's critically important that people subordinate their passions to reason.
Ben Franklin, after the Constitution had been completed, he's reported to have told a woman who asked him, "So, Mr. Franklin, what kind of government do we have?" And he says, "A republic, if you can keep it." Can we make it? Can we keep it? Can we keep the democracy? And the Lyceum Address is a moment in time. It's a snapshot where Lincoln says, look at this photo. We're losing it. We're losing this democracy right now. It's happening before our eyes. And if we're not careful, we'll lose it completely.
The key lesson of Lincoln's Lyceum Address is that violence is not the answer. That no matter how much you may disagree with an opponent, in a representative government, resorting to arms is the worst thing you can do. That our republic has a system of law in place, and that the rule of law should be above any monarch, any tyrant, any strongman.
When we look at why Lincoln concludes with George Washington in the Lyceum Address, he says we need our Washington to emerge. What's Washington? Who is Washington? Is he the general who crosses the Delaware River? Is he the general who inspires troops at Valley Forge? Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon, the tyrants that Lincoln references at the Lyceum Address, they could have done anything Washington did on the battlefield, and they did, and more, arguably. But what they could not do, the greatest gift Washington gives, is he stepped away from power. Personal restraint. To have all that power and greatness before you and to say, you know what? That's enough. It's someone else's turn.
Lincoln's Lyceum Address was published in the Sangamon Journal, the complete text, the week after he presented it. The impact at the time, it's very hard to know. Nobody sent in letters to the editor. There wasn't compliment. There wasn't criticism. It was silent. That was very common. The response subsequently has been to see it as a really key touchstone moment for looking at the ways that Lincoln's public speech evolved through his career.
I think the real contribution Lincoln makes, frankly, is for us today. It's for us to review the Lyceum Address as not just a part of the historical archive or a footnote to Lincoln's career, but what does it say to us? We're going to have, in a large democracy like ours, groups, ideas, ideologies that we really profoundly disagree with, maybe even revile. Nevertheless, in a multiracial democracy, we have to abide them. And if we disagree, we have to root them out, not through violence, but through discourse, exercising our rights, freedom of speech, through the democratic process. That's the difference. That's the gift of the Lyceum Address in many ways.
The reason why Lincoln's words are so timeless is because the issues that he addressed in his speeches still live on with us. It is so important for us to read some of those messages and realize that these issues are not current, that they've not just been made up today, that they've been with us for a long time, and that Lincoln was one of the first presidents to address them head on in all his speeches, starting with the Lyceum Address, ending with his second inaugural address a month before he is assassinated. He is still talking about these issues. There's a reason why I think we continue to revere Lincoln and that each generation discovers Lincoln, because his words on the value of our institutions, on the value of our democracy, are timeless.
Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the second in a special two-part Fourscore Speaker Series program featuring experts from our newest documentary series, Fortifying Our Democracy, Lincoln's Lyceum Address. We're grateful to Iron Mountain for their generous support that made this project possible. We hosted the first part of this program featuring Dr. Kate Mazur and Dr. Saladin Embar during National Civic Learning Week. And although the official Civic Learning Week may have ended, in the spirit of Lincoln's Lyceum Address, for us, Civic Learning Week never ends. So last week, we held a webinar for educators focused on new learning resources that complement this film series. And today, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Angela Ray and Dr. Manisha Sinha for part two of our discussion on the documentary series, which is focused not only on Lincoln's 1838 speech called The Perpetuation of Our Political Institutions, but the context of that time and the lessons and key takeaways for us today. To recap some of the national and global context for our discussion, at the time Lincoln delivered his speech, democracies of any sort were still extremely rare and were not relatively old. And so the idea that this could fail was not abstract. Compare that to today. This is a record-breaking year for elections with more than 2 billion people anticipated to vote in 50 countries, including the United States, the European Union, and India, which is considered the world's largest democracy. At the same time, concerns have been raised about democracy being in decline globally. Various indices exist that catalog what we know from the historical record to be true, which is that democracy can be established and strengthened as much as it can be weakened and destroyed. And it's incumbent upon us as citizens to ensure the former, not the latter. And now to introduce our expert guests. Dr. Angela Ray is an associate professor and the associate dean for graduate education in the School of Communication at Northwestern University. Her book, The Lyceum and Public Culture in the 19th-Century United States, analyzes a 19th century public media network and won numerous awards. She's presently writing a book about a debating society organized by young free Black men in antebellum Charleston, South Carolina, and evidence of its impact during Reconstruction and afterward. Dr. Manisha Sinha is the James L. and Shirley A. Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut, the President-elect 2025 of the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic, and a multi-award-winning author, including accolades for her book, The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition. And her newest book, The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic, Reconstruction 1860 to 1920, is out now. Angela and Manisha, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Angela, you literally wrote the book on lyceums during this period in the US. So I'd like to begin with you. Can you first just frame for our audience, what is a lyceum? What purpose did it serve in the United States in particular during this time?
Sure. The term lyceum alters its meaning across the course of the 19th century. At the time that we're considering today, lyceums were local organizations that promoted activities like debating and public lecturing. So they were typically for young men, they were typically for young white men, they were for ambitious men. I think the term ambition is key for us today, given what we've just seen. Young men who would join lyceums would want to be involved in discussing issues of their time. They would want to learn skills in speaking. They would probably imagine themselves as being directly involved in democratic processes of various kinds. So Lincoln, we know, was involved in a debating society when a few years earlier than this in New Salem, Illinois. The young men who would participate in the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield we know that they got together on a regular basis from the late 1830s into the early 1840s. They debated questions. What we know about the Young Men's Lyceum is drawn primarily from newspaper ads for events that they're about to host. So I think critical for our discussion is that these young men had debated a key question up to 3 times in the previous couple of years that's directly related to the theme of Lincoln's Lyceum Address, and that was, do the signs of the present times indicate the downfall of this government? So that was considered to be a valid debating question with pro and con arguments, easy enough to marshal. So the fact that they repeated this question, this is the question they seem most often to have repeated, indicates that this was really a very much a valid concern for people at the time. Lyceums, I won't go into much more detail than this, but lyceums morphed across the 19th century to become less about local groups getting together to debate and speak to one another, and it became more a forum for traveling public lecturers to come to town, give lectures on themes of interest to people and communities. That's more common really after the Civil War.
Excellent. Thank you, Angela.
Mhm.
Manisha, one of the other major issues that was happening at the time, so this is a related question, is what were some of the issues facing freedom of speech and press in the 1830s?
Yes, so this is precisely the moment that a radical interracial abolition movement is born. William Lloyd Garrison starts publishing The Liberator in 1831, and even before that, African Americans had been demanding an immediate end to slavery. And this was a fairly small group of men and women, blacks and whites, who demanded not only an end to slavery, but also Black equality and Black citizenship in the North. So it was seen as an extremely radical demand.
Mhm.
And many of the people who reacted to the abolitionist movement, not just in the South, where a price was put on their heads, including that of Garrison, but in the North, many politicians, even people who were involved actually as judges and lawyers, what we call gentlemen of property and standing, saw the abolitionist movement, tiny as it was, as a real threat to the union with Southern slaveholders, and they reacted rather violently in a sort of an orgy of mob violence. So if you look at the 1830s, you have so many cases of Black schools and colleges being burned down, African American communities being attacked, abolitionist lecturers being attacked and stoned. And many times law enforcement would just look the other way. And this, I think, is the backdrop against which Lincoln is speaking, because in Illinois itself, of course, in 1837, Elijah Lovejoy, an abolitionist editor, is murdered defending his press. And he comes to Illinois from Missouri. He sort of escapes Missouri, a slave state, because he was an editor there and he had condemned the lynching of a Black man, Francis McIntosh. And you can see that all this is on Lincoln's mind. Because if you look at the speech, he refers to the sort of mob violence. He sort of connects the existence of slavery. He refers to the Mississippi slave insurrection scare in Mississippi that led to lynchings and hangings of people. So he's clearly already thinking at this stage that this is a major problem for the American Republic and one that needs to be addressed. It's a very thought out speech that refers to this anti-abolitionist violence that is taking place and how reasonable men should respond to it. Lincoln himself is not an abolitionist. He makes that quite clear a year before this speech. But he's more concerned about the about the violence rather that abolitionists have to face at that time.
Thank you, Manisha. Well, and to that, or building off that point, speeches can be used to incite violence or mob justice. And Angela, I wondered if you could share your analysis of Lincoln's rhetoric in this speech and maybe how it compares to some of his other speeches, but also how does the rhetoric reflect his professed value in our system of government, the system of sort of law and order and discourse? Because as Manisha is pointing out,
Sure.
there are these conspiracy theories, these incitements of non-violence, and a lot of that time that happens through speeches as well. Lincoln's making this speech.
Right.
How does the rhetoric compare?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that the first thing I'd like to say about that is that, as Manisha has already said, this is a very well thought out, very carefully planned, very crafted speech. This is not extemporaneous oratory. That is what one would expect of if you invite someone to come and speak to your lyceum. That is the type of, you'd want formal discourse. So this is Lincoln pretty early in life. He's an attorney. He is presenting himself before his constituents, before his neighbors there in Springfield. He wants to do well. I see the rhetoric of this speech is very much about practice for things that will, for leadership, right? He's learning the skills of leading. He's practicing them. There are characteristics of this speech, as others have said, both on the video and here today, that track through his career. One thing that enlisted, Erin, your question about how does it represent values of democratic values. One thing that I would point to particularly is the way it's structured. It's structured around a series of questions. He simulates a dialogue with his audience. He asks, I have the speech here, but you are perhaps ready to ask, what has this to do with the perpetuation of our political institutions? Later on, the question recurs, how shall we fortify against it? But it may be asked, why suppose danger to our political institutions? Have we not preserved them for more than 50 years? He, in what is a monologue, he creates the impression, the performance of a dialogue with an audience that's asking questions of him to which he can then respond. I think embedded in that choice, in that structural choice, is a deep commitment to dialogue, discussion, deliberation, to listening to contrary points of view. He also is quite explicit, in the content of the speech in talking about the value of the rule of law, particularly, and learning to temper one's passions, to channel your ambitious energies in directions that are going to be productive for the collective.
So on that point, you noted how Lincoln is encouraging or espousing that point of view. He saw mob violence as a big problem and a threat to the American experiment. Essentially, if the government can't protect me, my commitment to the government diminishes. Lincoln's advocating for working through the system to affect change. And that's a historic push and pull you see with each generation. The system's the problem, or we have to use the system for change. Are you working within it? Are you working outside of it? If a law is unjust, repeal it. But repealing does require power. So I would love to hear from each of you on how does Lincoln address that, indirectly or directly, that acknowledging the fact that does require power, and there are a lot of people there is an understood imbalance of power. How does he reconcile that, and how would you comment on that? And Manisha, if you want to take this first.
Sure. That's a great question because, Lincoln, we read his speeches and we see, as Angela has said, a master rhetorician in, you can make out the way he thinks. He's a deep, thoughtful person. He clearly is, most of his speeches are very well structured, but he's also a politician and a very ambitious one. And if you think about it, here's Lincoln, a young state legislator, a Whig. He's just 28 when he gives the speech. And it's clear that he is establishing himself as a statesman, as an aspiring statesman at that time, perhaps. And it's quite clear also that he knows that in order to effect the kinds of changes that he wants to see in the system, like certainly an end to mob violence, more reverence for the Constitution and the laws, you need to have the political power and the voice to make that happen. And with that, I think we should balance also his commitment to principle. For instance, when he chose to go against virtually the entire Illinois state legislature that condemned Elijah Lovejoy for his own murder, basically condemned the abolitionists for provoking violence against themselves, he distances himself from that. And the only other person who signs on to it is a lame duck legislator who is not going to run for office. So just two of them. So Lincoln clearly sees himself as a politician who is going to go on to contest for political power. But again and again in his life, we see that his commitment to principle is something that he balances with political ambition. And he sticks with the Whig Party for a long time till it actually just disintegrates under him. And he is one of the latecomers to the new anti-slavery Republican Party. So yes, he is calculating his political ambitions. I think he realizes that in order to effect change or even to implement his vision for the republic, he needs to have political power. And we'll see this all throughout his career. I don't want to go too far ahead with the 50s and how he comes to be the presidential nominee, but you can already see him as sort of laying the ground in this Lyceum speech. That yes, I'm an ambitious young man and I want my statesman-like views to be known to people. This is the platform I'm going to stand on. Um, he clearly is a lawyer, and most lawyers in antebellum America invariably got involved in politics. And you can see this ambitious nature of his, of his early career. He is making contacts with people. He's representing a wide variety of people. He clearly envisions a political career for himself. It's not clear whether he thinks that he would actually become the president of the United States, but he's modeling himself after great Whig statesmen like Henry Clay, who he calls his beau ideal of a statesman. He wants to be a powerful person, if not the president, certainly in Congress, the way Clay was seen at that time. So yes, I think he has a keen awareness also of politics and political power, but is also warning against being completely driven by a lust or a passion for power. The speech makes it quite clear that if you are a demagogue or if you're a Caesar or a Napoleon or an Alexander, this is not what our republic needs. Our republic needs statesmen like Washington, who showed at the height of his power that you can leave that behind and set an important precedent.
Yeah, I think that I would add that the ways in which within this speech that Lincoln demonstrates political acumen also extends to being not taking stands on particular issues. There's some ambiguity here and there. Okay, so he certainly, it is for this, as Manisha said, at this moment, the fact that he does not blame abolitionists for the violence visited upon them makes him, that's a fairly strong statement for that place and that time. He, at the same time, about abolition and mob violence, abolition is either right or in itself, or it is wrong and therefore proper to be prohibited by legal enactments. In neither case is the interposition of mob law necessary or justifiable, so on. But he doesn't, in that passage, come down and make a value judgment really about is abolition right, is abolition wrong. He's keeping some, he's not an abolitionist as is at this moment, but he's keeping kind of those two possibilities of assessment in tension. He's also, when he talks about bad laws, as you mentioned, Erin, so he talks about we need to be upholding the law. And he says, if there are bad laws need to be altered through the ordinary legislative process. But while they stand, we need to adhere to them. But then, he goes on and says, but then let them, if not too intolerable, be borne with. Well, as a reader, that makes me say, well, if not too intolerable, okay, intolerable to whom? And what would too intolerable look like? And then if something is too intolerable, what can I do? Can I not observe the law? So there are some I mean, that seems to me a moment that's a little bit inconsistent with the general tenor of the speech. But we are looking at a young man who is learning skills of leadership, recognizing what one needs to do politically to be careful and about assertions, and probably figuring out. We see Lincoln, we see Lincoln's, especially his espoused public attitudes toward abolition alter across time through experience, right? But we do see in this speech some, I think, evidence of a young man struggling to make decisions and make, what kind of leader am I going to be?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's really fascinating and makes me wonder what Lincoln's position on civil disobedience would be. There's mob
Exactly.
violence.
Exactly.
And then there's
Right.
And
No,
that
exactly.
actually makes me think of
Yes.
your research on Black debate societies in South Carolina after
right.
Nat Turner's rebellion. So were lyceums and debate societies themselves an occasional act of civil disobedience?
That's not where we would typically look for civil disobedience in lyceums of the 1830s and 40s and 50s. Okay, not at all.
Good to know.
Very much a training ground, an educational forum, a training ground for learning for learning the skills of leadership, generally by people who are apt to be able to lead, okay, culturally. We do see now, that this is taking us in a different direction, but you did mention it. So if you look at organizations, especially run by free Blacks in northern cities, a few in southern cities as well, you see the same kinds of training. You see young men learning skills of leadership. They could imagine using those skills within free Black communities, within church settings, within benevolent societies, and so on. Because of the way the Civil War occurred and some of the opportunities of Reconstruction, you see some of these young men later in their lives deploying these skills in other arenas. But one thing I'd mention about the question of civil disobedience, we do see in the 20th century quotations from Lincoln's Lyceum Address being used to try to discourage civil disobedience, especially during the Civil Rights Movement. Yeah, and people have used the Lyceum Address in lots of different ways, but some of that reverence for the laws business has recurred in American history as people look back to the Lyceum Address, say, well, Lincoln said you ought to be obeying the law. And I think there's more ambiguity here.
Yeah, fascinating. Manisha, do you have anything you want to add to that or comment on?
Yes, I see the abolitionists as kind of pioneering civil disobedience tactics. Of course, Thoreau writes this famous essay also as a protest against slavery. Lincoln doesn't directly comment on these things, but he does say that people have the right to, the freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. So you would think that that would, in fact, cover civil disobedience in a republic. You should be allowed to do this. And these lyceums are so interesting because in New England, abolitionists try to desegregate them. And there are many famous speakers, including Emerson and Charles Sumner, who refuse to speak at segregated lyceums. So they become an area of contestation, but amongst New Englanders, at least at that point. You can also see abolitionists sort of sitting in trains that are segregated with African Americans. So they are sort of pioneering the tactics that we normally associate with the 20th century civil rights movement. And maybe that's why the civil rights pioneers would call themselves the new abolitionists, because they're aware of Thoreau's essay and his influence on Gandhi, and then through that back to Martin Luther King Jr. So it's an interesting sort of circle of information, a sort of a transnational circle. As far as Lincoln is concerned, I mean, he does revere the laws. I mean, you can see this later on in his reaction to the very draconian fugitive slave law of 1850, which abolitionists say they will resist in the courtrooms, but also through street action. You know, they refuse to be arrested. They break into jails, quote, rescue enslaved people who are suspected fugitives. And Lincoln clearly says at that point that, you know, we have to respect the fugitive slave law because it is a constitutional mandate. It comes from the fugitive slave clause, but even there he can't completely support it because he says, but I do think there should be some protections for northern free blacks who were being kidnapped into slavery because the law was so draconian that you couldn't even sort of tell the difference, or it was rewarding federal commissioners with a bribe if they declared that a person was enslaved. So he sees that the functioning of the law at that time is fundamentally flawed. So he's saying, you know, this is typical Lincoln. He's a moderate anti-slavery politician. He says, well, of course, since the law is there, we should follow it, but we should have added protections for the free Black population in the North, because he's seeing how it is being misused in the North. So I think even his commitment to abiding by the law is always tempered by his very deep and sincere concern about human rights. You know, he throughout, even in the earlier phase when he is not talking about Black and political and civil rights, Illinois does not allow Black men to vote, and only a handful of New England states do at that time. He still makes a real differentiation and says, you can't violate. He doesn't use the term human rights, but he's always talking about, you know, an ability of a person to just live freely and, you know, earn the right to be safe from violence and to labor and receive wages for their labor. All those things, basic rights, should be protected regardless of race and regardless even of gender. At one point, he even uses the illusion of a Black woman. So again, Lincoln is complicated on these issues, and I think Angela is right. He's politic enough to have it both ways, but there is a certain kind of basic commitment that he has, not just to the Constitution, but to the ideas of the Declaration, that he thinks is the founding faith of the American Republic. That once the Republic gives up on that, then we've sort of lost the Republic.
Yeah, well, and that's a theme that he picks up on certainly in speeches throughout his political career. And so I would like to ask you both about how you place this speech, or how this speech for you fits within the arc of Lincoln's speech making throughout his political career. You touched on that both in the series, and both of you have alluded to it in this conversation. So yeah, that's the question, and I'm happy for both of you to take it. How do you see the speech in relation to his other political speeches? Either comparing it from one to another, or sort of how he evolves over time.
Manisha, would you like to start?
Sure, absolutely. I thought that since I spoke last, I was going to defer, but
Okay.
I do think that what the Lyceum Address gives us is a very strong indication of the kinds of preoccupations that Lincoln would have for the rest of his career. You see the question of slavery and race, the fact that he names McIntosh, the Black man who was lynched in Missouri specifically. He's concerned. This doesn't make him a big champion of Black equality, but he is concerned that any human being should be treated in that manner. He talks about the slave insurrection scare. He's thinking about these as potentially posing a danger to the Republic. He's seeing this. He's seen the question emerge over slavery and abolition, and he's seen the violent reaction to it. And it's not like Jefferson's fire bell in the night during the Missouri crisis, but it's somewhat, Lincoln is already, I think, aware that this is something that can really not break up the Union, because at that point, no one's talking about that. Maybe a handful of crazy South Carolinians who might have studied a long time ago, but but he's clearly seeing that this can be an issue that can challenge both the rule of law, the constitutional principles, but also principles of the Declaration, which he sees slavery in violation of. But he realizes that we're a political system which protects slavery in the states in the South. So you can see him wrestling with this, and I think it grows. It only grows later on. As a congressman in the 1840s, he doesn't make many big speeches, but he does oppose the Mexican War as a land grab for slavery, in line with the Whig Party. In the 1850s, if you look at all his speeches, you hear the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, you can see him continually evolving and thinking more deeply about these issues. Of course, then we have a sort of a political crisis because you do have the emergence of an anti-slavery party, which he ultimately joins. But he sees what's happening in the 1850s, and it's as if his premonitions and his fears that he expresses in the Lyceum speech are actually coming into play fully. So I do think that it's not as if Lincoln did not think about these things in his early career. In fact, if you look at his early public speeches, he's already being quite prescient in seeing this as a problem for the country.
Yeah, I agree that we can track continuity across Lincoln's career, especially in themes, in the topics that are being addressed, and we find most of it right here in the Lyceum Address. And we see evolution across time, but those themes are consistent. I think that the concern about what the nation means, the founding generation, how we need to look back at the founders, what our commitments are to the efforts that those who came before us have made, what are our responsibilities to carry forward the legacy that we've inherited. Those kinds of notions are very, very much present here. I think, too, that some specific terms that appear in the Lyceum Address, the notion of a proposition that has been in the Lyceum Address already proven by the founding generation, and now it's in the 1830s, our responsibility to transmit the legacy that they have bequeathed to us. The term proposition in the Gettysburg Address, we get this proposition that all men are created equal. A proposition is an argument. It's not something that's been proven. By the time we get to Gettysburg, we're thinking about a proposition not as something only that we've inherited that's been proven, but something we have a responsibility to continue to participate in the argument, right? It's not landed yet. The proposition that all men are created equal is something that is evolving and is necessary for every generation to take up, every generation to continue to prosecute that particular battle, to try to continue to make that case, to make that argument. I think that you see both specific linguistic markers here in the Lyceum Address that you can track across time, and also this recurrence of key themes.
Yeah, that's interesting. I appreciate the way you framed it, because I've heard some interpretations or takeaways from Lincoln's Lyceum Address that imply, well, it was created and it's ours to maintain, with this idea that it's fixed and it shouldn't be changed. When in fact, our system allows for these refoundings, these Second Republic, Manisha, this idea that we can radically change things through the systems that we have. Earlier in the
what we do with our, I'm sorry, this idea of ambition, right? So what do you do with the ambition? Because the young men of his generation, he himself, also profoundly ambitious, but if your job is just to transmit something that's already fixed, that's not all that inspiring in some ways.
Yeah. Well, so to build off that, then how do you see this idea of the importance of perpetuating our political institutions working hand in hand with this concept that each generation has to has to work towards or has to interpret what that means for their moment in time, their generation, their society. Manisha, do you want to start?
I think, yes, sure, absolutely. I think Lincoln is quite aware that the Republic has grown since its founding.
Right. Yep.
So if you look at the Lyceum Address, he is balancing two ideas there. One is the notion that the founding of the Republic is a really important achievement that has to be maintained by subsequent generations, no matter what challenges they face. And clearly, he feels in the 1830s, the biggest challenge to the Republic is this kind of mob violence against against the rule of law, against what he says, reverence to our constitutional principles. He's clearly seeing that challenge. But at the same time, the second idea that he's playing around with, and I think that's why he kind of ends with Washington and the founding generation, is that republics can be maintained only as long as their citizens are virtuous and law-abiding. And once you don't have that, once you do not have the ability to perceive the common good over your selfish personal self-interest, whether it's aggrandizing power or just getting carried over in momentary passions and becoming violent to express yourself, that is what really threatens a republic. And so those are very old Republican ideas. By Republican, I mean ideas associated with Republican government, that a republic can last only as long as its citizens are virtuous. So the Lyceum, I think, does something quite well. It calls out these timeless Republican ideas that most Americans in the 19th century are probably familiar with. And at the same time, points to the current challenges that they face. And he's basically saying is that we need to go back, as he later on would call our ancient faith, in our republic and its ideals. And that the only thing that can actually destroy this republic is from within. It's you compare it to Washington's farewell address, where he was concerned of foreign interference and foreign interference with Americans and then influencing American elections or influencing American political power. He warns against that in his farewell address. Lincoln is saying here, interestingly enough, that if there is going to be somebody who overturns our republic, and if there are going to be people who do this, it's going to be from within us, because no one else can challenge us.
Yeah, we will live through all time or die by suicide, says, as a nation of free men. Right. I think that could I pick up on this notion of virtue? And I think that it is important to notice that he uses religious language. He secularizes religious language somewhat, but he talks about the reverence, let reverence for the laws be the political religion of the nation. So he is inviting people to experience a feeling of adherence to the rule of law that is comparable to religious faith. So I think that is language that his audience would have found resonant and familiar, but that's pretty strong stuff, right? To suggest that that's where our adherence needs to be.
Yeah, that's a great segue to our first question from the audience from Melbourne. And I say that because you point out the fact that he's using language that would resonate with the audience. And Melvin asks, why or how come politicians don't make great speeches today like Lincoln?
That's $1 million question. I think there are moments where some recent politicians have made memorable speeches. They have a tough standard to live up to, which is Lincoln. Lincoln has an amazing facility with words and with, being self-educated. I think there's a sort of a genuine quality to his speeches that I, as a 19th century historian, always, turn back to, and you're always in awe of his words. But yeah, I can think of some speeches in recent times. You think of FDR's For Freedom speeches, or you think of JFK's inaugural address, or President Obama made a number of speeches. He was known also for making speeches. He became a politician. And I think the one that really catapulted him was that speech that he made at the Democratic National Convention, where he was
2004.
also
Yeah,
appealing, 2004.
right,
At least that's when he came across my radar, and where he's
right,
appealing for national unity,
right.
which is,
Mhm.
and his constant evocation of Lincoln,
Right.
and
Yeah.
Yes.
he's like making a more perfect union.
Yeah.
So I
Right.
think our politicians also lean on Lincoln,
Yeah.
Yes.
the ones that
Angela,
who make those
Yeah,
speeches.
I was
Yeah.
going to say the same, actually, that I do think that we can find evidence of fine speeches in recent times. Certainly, I think politicians who are students of the past, students of history, learn the skill and find oratorical skill to be something that is important to continue to cultivate, even in our mass mediated environment. I think we can find examples of very fine public address, even in recent times. But I do think that the people who tend to deliver that tend to have a historical consciousness and look to the past to think about the ways that persuasion has occurred in a democratic process in the past.
that's great. The second question comes from Greg, and it's very specific, so you may not know this, but it actually relates to the point that was just made about the fact that Lincoln was largely self-educated. Greg wants to know if we know what % of adult males were college educated or college graduates in antebellum Illinois, and did the public confer on them any special authority for leadership on issues of the era? So I guess another way of asking that, Greg, if I'm interpreting your question right, is, was there a reference, was there, status conferred on people or authority or power conferred on people by virtue of their, the education that they attained?
So there were colleges, of course, in antebellum America,
Right.
but I don't think a lot of people, professions that we associate today with college education, many of
Right.
them simply apprenticed or interned, including
Right.
lawyers,
Lawyers.
including
Yeah.
Yeah.
doctors too. So the way we think of the modern college university system, which is invented in Germany and comes to the US only in the late 19th century. But of course, you had, some of the revered older colleges that are still around today. There was
Right.
always a Harvard, there was always a Yale, there was always a Columbia, and people went there. They went there to be, and there were colleges, women's colleges had started opening up. But in terms of education, I think what distinguishes the North a little bit is the common school system, which is
Right.
invented in New England and spreads all through the North. The South doesn't really develop what we call today the public school system. The
Right.
South doesn't develop a common school system until Reconstruction, the period after the Civil War, my second American Republic, of which I see Lincoln being the first president, his election as inaugurating the Second American Republic. So I think that's important to know because, yes, there were people who went to some of these elite colleges and then went on to the professions and politicians, but it was not common at all. Even for professions today that you wouldn't want a doctor who didn't go to medical school,
Right.
but that was very common
Right.
in antebellum America. And there were some
Right.
people who tried to get medical education in regular medical schools, but that was all relatively new.
Yeah. And a related question to that, then number 3, and because we do have, there are some really great questions in here I want to make sure we get to. Michael asks, how or where did Lincoln learn his rhetorical skills? Angela, do you want to take that?
Oh, I think that what we know about that is that reading, and he was involved in a debating society when he was in New Salem, Illinois. He's kind of famous for spending a lot of time talking to his fellows, right? Sitting around, I'm imagining sitting around the stove, trading stories and such. The kinds of the ambitious professional class that Lincoln both then aspired to join and did in fact participate in, spent a lot of time learning these skills among themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think reading is an important thing to note also. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So for the fourth question, Mark says, thank you for the wonderful series and video. And he asks if there are other Lyceum speeches that you might recommend viewers look for, either from Lincoln or other orators that are as impactful and prescient. The high bar.
Oh, gracious. Let me think about that a minute. Manisha, you want to have a crack at that one? I have to say that most of the Lyceum speeches that, so political speeches per se, not terribly common in Lyceum venues. It was, more common to say philosophical speeches or historical narrative or talking about, say, literary production. Most of the Lyceum speeches that I would tend to teach in class come from a little bit later period and so there are some very fine speeches delivered in Lyceums by people like Frederick Douglass in the 1870s, for example. You see in the post-Civil War period, I could name you several Lyceums, individuals who gave Lyceum addresses that I think are quite rich and interesting. Elizabeth Cady Stanton gave Lyceum speeches. There was one called Our Girls that really offers child rearing advice to a mass audience that's kind of subtly suggesting feminist principles. I mean, that's an interesting Lyceum speech, but a lot of them are meant to be very entertaining. But the expectations of a Lyceum address also changed across time. And what I was just talking about is a little bit later than where we are.
Yeah, and for the earlier period, I would recommend Emerson. He gave a number.
Yes.
Ralph Waldo Emerson, if you go through his collected writings, you'll find a number of really excellent Lyceum speeches that he gave. He was, in fact, one of the most sought after. A lot of these transcendentalists, intellectuals, especially in the New circles. And there were, as Angela has referred to, there's Frederick Douglass, but there was this Black abolitionist by the name of William Cooper Nell, who would invite many of these luminaries to come and give these speeches. It's interesting to me about the Lyceum culture was in New England that it was not an elitist one. Workers would also have their own Lyceum. So if you go to New England towns, you will see halls that are called mechanics halls. Mechanics was the antebellum term for the working class. So it was not as if this was a sort of high society and available only to elites. This was actually quite a public lecture that was open to a wide variety of citizens, and that's why the question of segregation comes up in these Lyceum New England very fast, because African Americans want to attend these speeches, and they, when they are segregated against, then people protest about this, abolitionist protests. So I really like this idea of self-education that comes with the Lyceum culture of that time, because these are public lectures. They are open to a lot of people. So yes, women, certainly African Americans in New England also would participate.
Great.
So yeah,
Yeah.
I can only think of Emerson right now, but I'm
Right.
sure that
Yeah, I would
this-
agree that Emerson would be the place to go for the early period. I also think that that there was a phrase often used in the 1820s and 30s in Lyceum culture, associations of adults for mutual education. So the idea is that it is also a collective activity. It is about self-education for sure, but it's self-education within a collective environment. You learn from one another. You learn from hearing, you learn from being heard. You learn when people respond to you, that tells you some things that, helps you improve your skills, but also kind of, elevates the intellectual life of your community.
Yeah, that's fantastic. On that note of education and seeking things out, self-education, our next question is asking, and Phyllis, I'm going to try to squeeze in these last two that we have from the audience. Charlie asked, what are each of your top must-read Lincoln books? And he asked for top 3, but since we're short on time, if you want to give us 1 or 2, that's all right as well. Must-reads. Manisha, why don't you go?
So I would definitely recommend my mentor's book, Eric Foner's book. Yeah, The Fiery Trial, Abraham Lincoln and American Slavery. I think that's a great book. And the latest book that I've just read and that I'm looking right now at my shelf, I have a whole shelf of just Lincoln biographies. You can have many more because there are just so many. Is John Meacham's new book, And There Was Light. Because I think Meacham's Lincoln book is so aware of our current divisions that the way he writes it is probably not the way an academic historian would do it, but I think it really does speak to us today at this moment. So I would recommend that one too.
I appreciate that. And we're honoring Meacham with our Lincoln Leadership Prize on May 21st.
Oh, wow.
Angela, do you have a book
Great.
you want to recommend?
Yeah, I think that I have found especially helpful several of the books by historians and others about Lincoln's language. So Douglas Wilson's work on the characteristics of Lincoln's speeches, I think, is very thoughtful and rich. And its title is not coming to me immediately, but
I think
easy
that's
enough to find.
Lincoln's Sword, is that the one?
Sword, that's
Yeah.
it. That's the one I'm thinking about. Yes,
That's
thank you,
a fantastic book. Excellent. Well, Dr. Ray, Dr. Sinha, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a wonderful conversation. And Phyllis, back to you.
All right. Thank you both so much for lending your expertise to the Fortifying Our Democracy project and for joining us for tonight's discussion. We're also grateful for our partnership with Iron Mountain and to be able to share this educational project with our members and donors. Next up, please join us on April 25th and 26th for the 2024 Lincoln Symposium in partnership with Carthage College and the Lincoln Forum. On May 7th, we are thrilled to host author Harold Holzer in Springfield, and we'll be bringing that to you via live stream as well. On June 11th, we're excited to host historian and author Doris Kearns Goodwin for an event also in Springfield. So we have lots of great things happening in the coming months. We encourage you to visit our website at lincolnpresidential.org to check out more information. Finally, as you close out tonight's webinar, we thank you in advance for taking just a quick moment to complete a survey. And as always, we thank you for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you all in May. Good night.